Hi, everyone. This is Zoha Wasim from the Urban Violence Research Network, and you're watching Street Talk. Street Talk is an initiative by the Urban Violence Research Network, in which we talk to experts and academics and researchers about their ongoing research and their fieldwork and publications, etc. And today today I have with me a very dear friend of mine and an up and coming scholar. He's a PhD candidate at the King's India Institute. Sudhir Selvaraj, and he's been working on violence against religious minorities in India. And I think I'm just going to get right into it. So Sudhir, welcome to Street Talk. And
Thanks,
thank you
Lisa.
for joining us, and thank you for taking out the time. I know it's towards the end of term and everyone's going home now, but thank you so much for joining us today.
No, happy to, sir. Thank you so much for having me.
Great, Sudhir. So if you can tell us a little bit about what you've been researching on lately and what your PhD is about, I think everybody would be really interested to know. We finally have someone to speak on India today. So if you can tell us what you have been researching on and what got you interested in this topic in particular.
Sure. So my PhD looks at violence against Christians in India, particularly. I do touch on other religious minorities, but I particularly look at Christians. And I take a broader approach to violence. So not just physical violence, but I look at how structures are responsible for forcing violence onto Christians. So, for example, I look at the anti-conversion laws in India, and I look at denial of reservation rights for Dalit Christians as my two examples for structural violence. I started off my PhD project in 2016, trying to look at how violence against Christians impacts secularism. But then the problem when I started looking at it is that there wasn't too much written on violence against Christians in India. Stuff has improved significantly, but I thought then to change direction and say, let's look more, take a deeper look at what violence against Christians in India is as an actual phenomenon. And then hopefully in a later stage, look at how that impacts secularism.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think it sounds like a very, difficult topic. It sounds that it must be a very personal thing to research on as well, and personally and emotionally, it must have been a very difficult experience. So, what was your fieldwork? What was your fieldwork like? What were the sort of challenges you had, and how did you go about researching on this topic?
Yeah, so I look again. I mean, the PhD forces you to go narrow and narrow and narrow. So I looked at the state of Karnataka because in India, there's a reason when you're looking at violence against Christians, there's a particular reason you should look at it from a state level instead of a national level. So each state has its own different aspects of the Christian population, how long they've been there, if it's largely upper caste Christians or lower caste Christians. So, for example, a majority of Christians in India, close to 70%, are actually Dalit Christians, and then about 20% are tribal Christians. So you have only a small portion of this Christian group who come from the upper caste. So that will largely be in around the coastal areas in Goa, in Mangalore, and in Kerala. So I looked actually at a different phenomenon because I looked at Karnataka, and Karnataka was impacted by a large-scale attack in 2008. So I look at it's now come to be known as the church attacks. So I looked at the church attacks and then the resulting efforts to try to make a freedom of religion law there. But these laws are now known as more anti-conversion laws because they target Christians. We can talk about that as we progress. So,
Sure. So
but
that's really interesting. If you can tell the some of our viewers might not be very familiar with what's driving the violence against Christians
yeah,
and the Christian minority. If you can just talk and just give a bit of a background, what is happening, and specifically the church attacks that you mentioned.
yeah.
What was that particular incident?
Perfect. And I'll also intertwine it with the previous question you asked me about the research and stuff. So what happened is in 2008, there were two large-scale instances of Mal in Orissa, and that was the worst series of violence. But then, almost related to it, and not almost, very much related to it, as my research shows, there was attacks in corresponding attacks in Karnataka, largely executed by Bajrang Dal, which is an organization associated to the Hindu nationalist ideology, and also the Sri Ram Sena, which is an affiliated group to the Bajrang Dal. So just to take a step back, the Hindu nationalist ideology roots back to the 1800s, but it was formalized in 1920 by V.D. Savarkar. And how the ideology views Christians is as outsiders. So if you're a religious group which had its origin in India, so Sikh, Buddhists, Hindus, and Jains, then you are very much part of the homeland. But then if you are Christian or Muslim, you are seen as outsiders. This ideology developed over the years, and from 60s onwards, it started being not that Christians and Muslims were just outsiders, but that they were also enemies and intent on destroying the nation. So it was not just othering, but it was also othering with an intent to destroy this. So as we all know, as research shows, violence in India especially brings high electoral gains. So I suggest in this argument that the 2008 violence was in Karnataka was done to compound the violence, so to elevate the story of anti-Christian rhetoric in the country. This is a few years after the Gujarat violence. So the dividends reaped from Hindu-Muslim violence weren't paying off as much. So to make sure you keep maintaining the other, there was a planned and concerted effort to raise the profile of Christians and what the threat of Christians would be. So this is why the violence was executed in there, largely government. And the BJP government in Karnataka was the first time that the BJP had ever come into power in the state, in the any of the southern states rather, but first time in Karnataka. And this coincided with the 100 days of their administration. So when looking at this violence, this was about 10 years before I started my fieldwork. There's so a large chunk of my work was looking at reports and then trying to interview people who were impacted and different church groups and advocates. Finding these reports were very, very difficult. So these were from activist church groups, government, state government, and national government. Some of them are intentionally hidden, so I couldn't find it. Even when I filed RTI claims, I was summoned to justify it, but thankfully I was able to find it through other activist sources and things like that. But because it was 10 years ago, activists also talked about the pressing need to move on, the continuous activities that need attention and things like that. So there were certain circumstances where I was just given a hard drive saying 2007 to 2009, take whatever's on it, you can use it. So these are the challenges generally for that. But one thing broadly, and this is linked to Hindu-Muslim violence, is that so with Hindu-Muslim violence in India, there's the Vashiri Wilkinson Index that catalogs violence from 1900, and it's been extended several times after that. Nothing like that exists for Christians. So we don't even actually know the extent of the violence in most cases. So my research, I built a database from reportage in the Times of India from 1975 to 2010. So I was able to run some statistics about that to sort of figure out the patterns of violence.
Okay, that's really interesting. Building a database from scratch on that kind of violence, it must have not been easy. What was it like interviewing the activists, and were you able to interview some of the families or some of the victims of such violence in India?
Yeah, so in two parts. So there is a climate of fear right now. So there are a lot of people who are less willing to engage, a lot more hurdles that I had to go through. So a lot of people who are activists, even though they tangentially knew who I was and stuff, I had to go through other people. In often cases, they would say, let's sit down and meet first. Then I will sort of suss you out and see if we can share data and things like that. One person refused to type emails, so type responses in emails, didn't want to respond on the phone, we could only meet in person. So it is not the easiest aspect to look at in the way of collecting data. For this particular project, because it happened 10 years ago, I chose not to look at the victims, but sort of like the institutional church response. But I have done for another piece, simultaneous research. I did do research on the Kanthamal violence in Orissa. And there I wrote a play based on my experiences, but there I was talking to victims largely to hear what it is, what was happening, what it was like, what are their lives like now, where do they derive their strength to continue and things like that. So the play Homeland, I converted it to audio production, and that was done during COVID times. So when we were in lockdown, I used the opportunity to produce that. And that's also available. But if you want to hear more about those stories, I cataloged 4 different stories of people impacted and being displaced by the violence in that piece.
Guys, I should mention Homeland is available on SoundCloud, and we'll give a link to that below as well. It's an excellent audio production. I just heard it a few days back as well, and I think it's definitely worth listening to. Some of the accounts are very personal, they're very moving, and it just shows, as Sudhir was talking about, this climate of fear, not just in India but in Pakistan, across South Asia, and in different parts of the world again. in general. So I think if you have some time, definitely take our time for it, and I'll make sure to link it below as well. So that sounds like quite a bit of quite a bit of difficult fieldwork, and building a database from scratch on something like this. It must have been a it sounds I look forward to reading more of your publications, and I'll be sure to kind of be sharing them as well. If you can just talk a little bit about where the hotspots for such violence are in India. I think we earlier were talking about the fact that it might be more of a rural phenomenon, but you said you've done research in a city as well, in urban areas or in an urban area. So if you can just talk about like what the geography of such violence looks like a little bit, that would be great.
So based on my research on the data from 75 to 2010, there is a common aspect where the five most violent states for Hindu-Muslim violence, according to the Bashni Wilkinson Index, four of them are common to Christians itself. So that also might mean that these states particularly have an anti-minority sentiment compared to other states, and that's because of the geography of it. So those are the states which would be Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka. Orissa tends to fall in that aspect as the fifth one for Christians, but it's not for Hindu Muslims. But Muslims aren't a very prominent population in Orissa, particularly. So I'll tell you about two violence. So both the case of violence in 2008. The Kandhamal violence actually properly represents what the anti-Christian violence story is, right? It happened, Kandhamal is a district which is one of the least developed in the state, probably one of the least developed in the countries. Hilly area, no major access to education and medical facilities. And when I went there, some of the interviews would tell me, like, if you want a job, it's either with the government or the church. That's more or less it. Those are the only two employers in there. So this is where anti-Christian violence typically happens. It's largely directed towards tribals or Dalits, which make up a majority of the population, as we talked about. It's in areas which are not prominently in the city. So Hindu-Muslim violence is more prominent in cities, but this is not. Why I picked the example of Karnataka, and this violence happened in Dakshin Kannada, which is one of the most developed areas of Karnataka, famous medical and educational institutions, scored very highly on HDI, human development indicators, and things like that. And largely upper caste Christians. So these were the Mangalorean Catholics, very lot of institutional wealth and things like that. So it defies the story of what the anti-Christian violence story is. But what you found here again is, irrespective of the context, anti-Christian violence sentiment can be harvested to whip up violence and to make it more of a story. So it's not necessarily the common narratives, but just the fact that violence against Christians happened. And then you push the story of Christians are converting, Christians are targeting minorities, women, and things like that. So that's how they're elevating the othering aspect of what Christians do. So after the 2008 attacks, when I talked to church leaders and such in the group, they talked about the more immediate aspects of the physical harm and then the building's destruction. But they talked about a psychological harm more than that. They talked about this rift between the community. They felt like they were being part of the others. They felt like they were being watched and things like that. And this is nothing, because the Christian population in Mangalore has been around since the 1600s. So it's 400 years. And they said they've never actually experienced this sort of overlooking. Of course, they're still very well integrated and things like that. Some others would say nothing's wrong, everything's still the same. It was just a small thing and there's a small rupture and we're back to normal. But those words thing, the psychological harm stays with us, is what one person told me. In the violence itself, the police were found, and the police, it's important to note, are under the charge of the state government, not the national government, but the state government. So the police in this case were oftentimes joining with the protesters, oftentimes arresting Christians unnecessarily, not responding necessarily, even though violence was a part of the story, for like escalating violence for the past few years before these actual church attacks. So this is all the things that reports brought out when I was looking at it. But specifically, we're talking about the police when there are also anti-conversion laws, the freedom of religion laws in the country. And these have been passed in 10 states. They're active in about 6 or 7, but they've been passed in 10 states. And what happens is in these states, the words in each of the legislation is forced fraud allurement. Allurement is illegal. So, but the problem is they're so nebulously phrased, we don't know what force is. We don't know what fraud is. So if you say, for example, there is a God in heaven which nobody has seen, we have to have our faith in him and things like that, could that constitute as fraud? Allurement as, hey, if you come for VBS and we give you VBS materials, does that count as allurement or not?
Who gets
So
to
this
decide that? Who gets to
it's
interpret the law?
largely the district magistrates. So it's a question on that, but not so much of the law. The law, there are very few convictions under these laws. So it's not necessarily the laws that are the problem, but these Hindu nationalist groups we talked about earlier, the Majumdar, VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and things like that, they are the ones who tend to report these instances. So these para-political groups which are around the area, they're often looking around the place and bring to the attention of the police these activities. So oftentimes these people are brought to the police station saying, oh, they were converting. What were they doing? It was a VBS class. What were they doing? It was preaching in the church. So it's usually these attacks, or they were having a prayer meeting. These are the types of things, why it's so dangerous under these laws for that. But like I said, the convictions are almost negligible is what lawyers and activists told me.
And so what does so it's interesting, it's almost as if they're kind of using the police and this whole, maybe the process of even registering FIRs, for example, that's something we see in Pakistan as well, right? Is that when you want to, if you want to, mete out some, revenge or some violence against a particular group, you take a complaint to a police station and you lodge a fake FIR, a first information report, and you lodge a complaint with the police to get the police to kind of act against a particular group. So is that something you've seen, and what do you know if what is the response of the police normally when they're kind of used like this by particular groups?
Yeah, so my data is largely, because I didn't look into that aspect of it as much, but it's largely when talking to activists and lawyers who work on these cases, the conviction level is very low. But then the problem is because that threat of going to the police necessarily, I mean, not necessarily, but in some cases there was cases of police brutality. There were cases of definitely a bias in favor of the Hindu nationalist organizations who are bringing these reports into play. So it is a lot of people, the Christian aspect of it is we must give Caesar his dues. So like we must follow the government, and it's a very prominent aspect of that. So pay taxes, vote. It's ideals that are taught frequently in the Christian church. But at the same time, then you're also fearing the state. So how does that relationship manifest in is more fear than anything else. So so what happens when there's laws which are there to sorry, I'm not being very eloquent right now. But what happens when these laws which are there presumably to protect all citizens are actually directly violating your rights to practice your freedom of religion? So it's in a contradiction to it, because Article 25 of the Constitution says it's a freedom to practice, profess your own religion. So that is where the intersection is. Professing is the question, because how the Hindutva ideology sees it is professing means force, fraud, and allurement. While for other Christians, they maintain professing is spreading the good news of the Bible. That's why there's the tensions are coming up because of that.
So you mentioned you've interviewed activists and you've spoken with activists, and I'm sure some of them might be your friends, for example. It'll be interesting to note, like, what is the role of the civil society in kind of speaking for or speaking on behalf of the Christian minority, or providing access to justice, for example? Are there any kind of organizations, local organizations on the ground that are trying to speak about their rights or advocate for their rights? Did you see anything of that sort, anything outside the state apparatus that they can reach out to?
Yeah, so civil society is still, it was a lot stronger. It has weakened over the years in India, as we're seeing broadly across South Asia, I see as well. There is, in Karnataka especially, there's a very strong civil society movement. Things like the People's Union for Civil Liberties, the KKSV, and things like that. So the translation is the Karnataka Forum for Communal Harmony. So things like that, where organizations are very keen to promote this, because Karnataka for the longest time and still maintains that we are a peaceful state and a peaceful people. But these instances are becoming more common. And then a lot of these organizations will avert that the strengthening of the Hindu nationalist ideology and the organizations coming into the state, becoming stronger, is what's breaking up the harmony around the place. So, like for example, now the BJP has been in power has had three times that they've come back into power within from 2008 now. So they hold a very preeminent position in the state, and frequently they win the elections for the national election thing. Civil society does host that, and there's a lot of support. But at the end of the day, if the state is turning the screws on civil society in terms of FCRA funding, in terms of other things, it's going to be more difficult for civil society to keep operating and supporting people. And I'm not even specifically talking about my topic here, like broadly speaking, representing groups. Civil society has done a fair chunk, but it is getting increasingly harder.
And what about the role of the media? Because that's something, we see in just generally, like, around the world. Media, both broadcast, social media, traditional media, old and new. When it comes to kind of violence against or the persecution of minorities in general, I think social media has a really big role to play to kind of project the violence. And also to allow minorities to have a platform, but also sometimes social media can be used to perpetuate violence against minorities. So in India, what is that like? What is the role of the media?
Yeah, I think it's also kind of, there's been quite a few studies done of late. So I'll go back. This is Norwegian political scientist named Johan Galtung, whose framework I'm using. And he talks about the notion of cultural violence. So aspects of a culture that are used to justify the violence. So for example, the violence against Christians is not economic, there's no economic competition aspects of violence. There's very little, there's political aspects of it, but it's largely cultural. And you always peg it down to Christians, that conversion story again. So once you propagate this idea, it keeps on going. So in other studies and recent PhD theses that have come out, even in news media, they come out with a story saying, in most cases, Christians were found to be converting. Right, in Karnataka, in the local language newspapers, which I was looking at, in Kannada language newspapers, it says, there's a great story about and how they minoritize the boys. So they won't use the word men and women in these situations. So they would say a boy and a girl. So a Hindu girl was lured by a Christian boy who did this, this. So it's very much how you report it, what you report it, the angle that's shifted. But largely, the efforts of Hindu national cells, which are propagating more social media work on WhatsApp, Twitter, things like that. And again, this is broadly something we see across the region. Push the angle saying conversion. So then in your mind, you're automatically thinking, oh, there's violence against Christians, or they were probably converting. They deserve it. They brought this on themselves. So when you bring about those ideas, then you're sort of justifying it and making it more, okay, it's fine. It happened. They brought it on themselves. It's the same question. It's really unfortunate, but like the same question about, if there's a story of somebody being raped, the first question is, oh, what was she wearing? And it's stupid. Yeah. It's really stupid because that's not justification at all by any means, but that's the first thing people think about. African American was shot by the police. Oh, what was he doing? What drugs was he doing? It's automatically like a question. You don't even think about the broader, hey, listen, let's think about the thing. But it's your mind is being trained to think of things in a certain way.
That's really interesting. You also mentioned the violence is not being driven by economic agendas necessarily, but does it impact the kind of economic and professional choices that the Christian minority makes? So, for example, do you see any patterns of migration from rural areas to urban areas or anything of that sort that is affected or triggered by this violence in particular?
Yeah, I think, and again, this is, we keep saying Christian community in India, but unfortunately, it doesn't work too much as a community. It's a very heterogeneous group, and it's largely divided along caste, class, and different parts of the area and things like that. So, for example, in Orissa, the violence, it displaced close to 250,000 people from their homes. So houses were burnt down, churches were burnt down or destroyed. People just didn't have an option. They were hiding in relief camps. When they came back, whatever little money they had to build up their places, they could. But in those instances, then what are your other options? You have to go to a city. And one of the characters in my play talks about that. What is your option? You go, you struggle with a new language, you struggle to be able to be seen as this, you're not under any labor laws. If they're nice to you, you get your relative remuneration for what you do, which is not very much at all. But beyond that, what happens? So you increasingly see a large chunk of the tribal Christian population from Kandhamal who've gone to different cities around the place, most likely Bhubaneswar, but also in places like Bangalore and things like that.
And generally, do you feel like their experiences in the cities? Do you know of anything about in terms of what their livelihood is like in the cities when they move there? Is it a are they generally kind of, do they assimilate a little bit more easily? Are they accepted generally in urban areas a bit easily?
No, I mean, generally speaking, their professions would inevitably be construction work or security or housekeeping maintenance and things like that. But culturally, they're different. So, for example, even if you come to Karnataka and you're from Orissa, and especially a tribal Orissa, you're not even speaking Hindi, which you can sort of get by with in Karnataka. But if you're not even able to speak Hindi and you're speaking Kui, what type of a life is it, right? You're there, you're working, you're not being able to make friends. You don't know necessarily the instructions, which inevitably means there'll be a lot more shouting back at you. And then the problem is then you're ripe for economic exploitation. So, for example, will you get your full salary at the end of the month? You don't know for sure. Are you getting treated the same way as everybody else? It's not. And it's leading to a lot of alienation for these groups who already faced large-scale violence. So they're still haunted by those memories. But at the same time, they have to make sure they get some element of a livelihood so that they can support their family members who might still be back in different areas. So Kandhamal is a good example for that. But largely the upper caste Christians and things like that would be physical violence and some damage to churches, but they're largely wealthy Christians. So fixing up the churches won't cost too much and won't take up too much. It won't cost too much it won't be too much of a cost for them in that sense. So yeah, that's the case, and that's why we should recognize more that within Christianity there is a minority of the minorities, and it's the marginal identity that gets linked. So there's a huge intersection between Dalit and tribal identity and Christian identity, and
Right.
that's the part to recognize.
Right. Well, Sudhir, thank you so much. That was a very informative discussion. And I think that I have definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers have definitely learned a lot as well. And it sounds like a very, a very rewarding research that you're doing, but also very important research that you're doing. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for your publications. And once again, everyone, do check out Homeland on SoundCloud. It's an audio production based on a play, and we'll be sharing the link to that. And thank you for tuning in to Street Talk once again. You can follow us on you can follow our Urban Violence Research Network account on Twitter. And you can also check out our website at www.urbanviolence.org. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Zoha, and today I was speaking with Sudhir Selvaraj from King's College, London. Thank you and goodbye. Thanks, Sudhir.
Thanks.